Our second keynote speaker is Stephen Damianos. Stephen is Executive Director of the Neurorights Foundation. He's a scholar and practitioner at the intersection of public policy, ethics, and tech governance. He works to harness neurotech for social good. Additionally, he's a lecturer in ethics and public policy at Cornell University, and he's author of the forthcoming book, Asylum is Unavailable: Absence and Absurdity at the Digital Border. And he's going to talk to us today about neurorights and practice. Please welcome Stephen Damianos.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, to the conference organizers. Thank you to everyone for sticking around. I know I'm standing between you and Friday evening and drinks and whatever lays ahead, so thank you for your attention and for this event. It's really such a pleasure to be in this space with you, and especially to follow the really impressive and eye-opening and inspiring words and work that we had in Dr. Young's keynote this morning and in the panel on consciousness that we've just finished. And I'm really excited to build upon that work, be in conversation with that work, and explore kind of one of the provocations that Dr. Young left us with this morning or early afternoon about kind of the ways in which neurotechnologies are changing as they exist in the world and the locales of that change. Where are we seeing neurotechnologies exist in the world? I want to talk about what happens outside of clinical and medical settings because increasingly the story of neurotechnology is not one that is primarily a clinical story. And there's some sort of singing next door, which is quite fun, actually. It makes me want to break out in song as well, but I won't embarrass myself or ruin all of your days with that. So fueled by the convergence of neuroscience and artificial intelligence, neurotechnologies are expanding beyond the clinical setting for the first time. And a range of innovators and funders are developing cutting-edge tools to directly interface with the brain in everyday life. So we're seeing neurotechnologies show up in headbands and wristbands, earbuds, gaming systems, and athletic apparel. They're even sold on Amazon now. They're marketed to schools for students to improve their focus and attention, to athletes, to employers to monitor the focus and attention of their employees, and really to anyone who wants to sleep better, focus longer, or feel less anxious. And the biggest tech giants are leading the charge. Meta released its first neurotechnology device already. Apple has a patent for next-generation AirPods with EEG scanning technology in them. Nike, Snap, who own Snapchat, and a range of other startups are following them, while giants like Elon Musk and Sam Altman pour investment into the space through competing ventures. The non-medical neurotechnology market is surging as military and law enforcement applications quietly grow in parallel. There's a group in Brussels called the Center for Future Generations, and if they're not on your radar, I think they should be, because they do really, really wonderful work. And they released a report earlier this year in which they kind of mapped out the entire neurotechnology market, medical and non-medical. And one of their findings is that currently there are more consumer-facing neurotechnology companies than medical-facing neurotechnology companies. Of course, does this mean that all of those are long-standing, healthy companies? Many of them are small startups. They might not be here tomorrow, but still, there is something to learn and to listen to about this space and what it means about the changing landscape of neurotechnology, and importantly, neurotechnology governance. Investment in the sector grew, as you see, 700% between 2014 and 2021 alone, and the market was valued at $15 billion in 2023 and is projected to surpass $55 billion by 2032. So we're not talking about a niche emerging technology. This is on the path to become a mainstream market category, fast growing and headed toward ubiquity. And I argue that we're on the precipice of an altered human experience, and much like AI before it, this revolution is poised to reshape society and life as we know it. But what's interesting and also concerning is that outside of rooms like these, There's very little awareness of this fact. And one of the reasons it's a privilege and a pleasure to speak to you all today is because I'm in a room of people who know a lot more about what I'm talking about than I do, and who have worked in and work in neurotechnology, and therefore know what neurotechnology means. And that might sound silly, but I actually don't take that for granted. Virtually every conversation I have in my capacity running a nonprofit that does neurotech governance work immediately starts with what neurotechnology is, and a lot of confusion and a lot of questions. Usually someone has heard of the word, but it's almost only because someone in their life has Parkinson's or has undergone deep brain stimulation, or they have some vague association with this. There's almost always a moment of confusion or orientation. And this is also something I've been noticing with sophisticated donors and forecasters in the AI governance space. So this really seems like an absolute blind spot. I've noticed this in my personal life as well. I don't think any of my friends actually know what I do for work or understand it. My parents, a doctor and a nurse, still struggle to understand what I do. And at a Christmas party in December, I walked up as they were saying, he does something with the brain, and I had to fill it in there. And don't even get me started on first dates, where I just say, I work in tech, because it's easier than having to dive into the central and peripheral nervous system and getting total blank stares at, before a drink even arrives. And so, jokes aside, I'm confident that if I stopped 100 people on the street and asked them what neurotechnology is, I'd get mostly confused looks, probably some mention of Elon Musk, and maybe someone saying, oh, I saw Black Mirror, or I saw Severance. And what this tells me is that their brains would go to the sensational or the perceived futuristic, not the headband that their teenager will use at school to focus better, or the sleep wearable that will soon be on their nightstand. And we've seen in various settings that lack of public awareness is dangerous, right? Without public awareness, without public accountability, harms can accumulate. It's much easier to collect data that people don't know are sensitive. It's much easier to make wellness claims that people don't know how to scrutinize. When people don't know what neurotechnology is, let alone that it's coming, they don't know how it can go wrong, and they can't demand that we get it right. So I really wanted to start this conversation with an understanding that there's a risk of technology being governed entirely by those who create and sell the device, not those who use it. And right now, the people who are creating and selling the devices are moving quite quickly. So I want to just give a short kind of look at what the market looks like these days, with the caveat that I am not endorsing any of these products. I'm just saying they exist. But what I want to show here is the type of product in terms of what it looks like and how they market themselves. So a lot of these products exist in the hazy health wellness space, as distinct from a medical product, intentionally distinct, because then we have to engage with FDA and other regulatory regimes, but products that make quasi-medical claims about one's health, cognitive functioning, and wellness. So a lot of these are focused on sleep, on at-home neurofeedback, honing your flow state or focus, a lot of applications for students, athletes, people who work in high-stress jobs. This is where we're seeing the market really move towards. And what you're looking at is a market that has outgrown and is outgrowing the regulatory frameworks that were designed to govern it. And I want to note before I keep going that although the neurotechnology market is moving very quickly with its growth, the user base is still quite small. But I don't think it will be for long. So 1 in 3 Americans already uses some sort of a health tracking device. And if you consider your cell phone a health tracking device, we can make that 1 in 1 probably. And this is evidence, of course, of a deep and growing appetite for technologies that monitor and optimize the brain and the mind. And as systems like Claude and ChatGPT become increasingly embedded in how people make decisions, understand themselves, communicate, think, there is every reason to believe that technologies like these, which influence or purport to influence cognition, will follow a similar trajectory. And this is, of course, in many ways quite exciting, and I do want to flag the positive before I go all doomsday on you all. So wearable neurotechnologies, because they are rapidly advancing in sophistication and accessibility, they are unlocking extraordinary new capabilities. And I could have a whole discussion just on those, but these include enhancing memory and focus, optimizing sleep, providing new tools for at-home regulation of emotion and mental health, enabling remote control of devices, assistive devices for individuals with disabilities. And they also have democratic potential, particularly in the mental health space. For people, there are a growing number of people who feel either priced out of or misunderstood by the mental healthcare system in this country, and are turning to wearable neurotechnologies in a kind of experimental way. And actually, anecdotally, I can tell you that just a few weeks ago, I met with a 50-year-old man who is an investor, and he has chronic depression. And during kind of an intense period of suicidal ideation, he turned to one of the devices on the market called the Muse headband, which uses neurofeedback. And in his words, the Muse headband and neurofeedback saved his life. And we had a coffee, and he said, I would not be here today if not for this. And so there are increasingly a lot of people who are exploring what this could be. Of course, are all these products scientifically validated? Will they work well for everyone? No, but there is potential in that space. So as we've seen in many other spaces of emerging technology, we cannot consider the promise without considering the peril. And right now, there is an enormous amount of risk, not only that comes with what the devices, the kind of harm that the devices might structure in people's lives, but also what that could mean for the wider potential of the space and how that could lead to downstream effects that prevent devices and technologies that enhance the quality of life from accessing those who could benefit from them. So just very briefly on the policy landscape, this is a fast-scaling space, but the consumer neurotechnology landscape operates with almost no safeguards. There's a pretty big loophole, which is that the clinical and medical devices, although as Dr. Young mentioned before, as industry becomes more involved, there's a bit of ambiguity and lack of clarity there. But in general, FDA and HIPAA come into play with these devices and the data that they collect. When you take neurotechnologies outside of clinical settings, even if they use medical grade technologies, the data they collect are considered consumer data, much like your browsing history, for example. So in most jurisdictions around the world right now, there's no difference between the cookies on your computer that you press accept or reject and EEG data that might be collected from a consumer wearable device. Especially for the clinicians in the room, anyone who is familiar with the sensitivity of this type of data, that should be scary, right? That should be concerning. This is not, this is apples and oranges in terms of the type of data that we're talking about. Very briefly, I'll say that the global policy landscape looks quite similar. GDPR and the EU AI Act have some kind of a patchwork of protections in Europe. I will come back to this later, but I just came back from a trip to Asia. There's not a single jurisdiction in the whole Asian continent that has any legislation or protections in this space, which is concerning. But there are a number of countries. In February, Canada became the first country in the world to have a full federal protection for consumer neural data. And there are a number of other countries that are moving these protections forward as well. So why is this so concerning? One of the reasons is that neural data do not constitute just any other type of data. Although sometimes I hear this conflation a lot in the spaces I work in, of people who say neural data and biometric data are the same. As a matter of science, they are not. And as a matter of sensitivity, they are not. Most data tell you what someone did, purchase history, location, browsing, records of actions and choices. Neural data as electrical activity recorded directly from the peripheral or central nervous system provide a window into the innermost worlds of humanity that can bypass expression and behavior entirely. And therefore, as Dr. Young had mentioned before, and as the panelists prior to me did as well, it also can reveal elements of people and their inner states that they may not even have chosen to disclose, and importantly, may not even themselves be aware of. I'll note that the clinicians and researchers in this room will be quick to remind me that consumer wearables produce far more crude data than implantable neurotechnologies do. And the difference is particularly stark when it comes to the decoding of inner speech and thought, where the capabilities of implantable brain-computer interfaces, of course, outpace those of wearables. But that's not to say that wearable devices don't have any meaningful decoding capabilities. They do, and those are growing. And it's really actually not to say either that the risk of harvest now, decode later is not something that we need to be actively and very carefully attuned to. So the general kind of public media is starting to pick up on this, and understandably, the news and the media go towards the sensational, and so ideas and thoughts about thought reading, mind reading, eavesdropping is another term that's used. These come up a lot, and so we're starting to see more and more murmurs about, okay, is it possible to access human thought? What would this mean? And regardless, there's a lot of disagreement about what exactly that looks like, what the timelines will be. But even with significant technical barriers in certain spaces, particularly the consumer space, we are moving towards a future where our most private information can be fairly easily shared and accessed, and right now has almost no protections to speak of at all. So that leads us to a reality where we can no longer operate under the assumption that the contents of our brains are private. And we spoke a bit earlier about the idea of consent. And informed consent, of course, grounds a lot of the work in many of the spaces that we exist in, grounds almost all of biomedical ethics, and operationalizes the idea of bodily integrity, right? You have the right to know what could or will happen to your body, and therefore to make decisions about that. And so there are questions about whether there might be limits to that with neurotechnologies. When I post something on social media, for example, I know what I said. I created the content and I put it out there. It's a little bit different when a neurotechnology device that I'm using to sleep better, for example, interprets my neural signals and then creates meaning from that. You don't know what data were extracted. You don't know how they were interpreted or categorized. You don't know where they will go. And there's a real illegibility that emerges from this. The way that I like to think about it is, if I landed at Boston Logan, or if we're flying out and a TSA agent asked me to go through my bag, I would know exactly what they would and would not find in my bag because I packed it. But if Meta is going through my brain scan, I'm sorry, I have no idea what they, will or will not find today and in the future, let alone what they will say they found and where that will migrate afterwards. And so there's a technical pipeline here that is entirely inaccessible by nature of a private company applying their proprietary algorithm to your brain scan. And I also think that we're in a moment, although there could be some backlash, where there's a tendency to treat outputs that come from technology as objective or authoritative. I see this with my students and the way that they don't really critique or have a critical eye for what is spit out at them on Claude and ChatGPT. Of course, they don't speak for everyone, but we do know that this is something that is occurring. And what worries me is that, in general, there's a sense that people lie, but bodies tell the truth. And therefore, you can't really trust a person. They might be deceiving you, but you can trust information that comes from their body. You can trust medical information. Of course, this is not being collected in a medical setting, but neural data have only ever been associated with medical settings. And so therefore, there's kind of a chance that the data are more likely to be treated as diagnosing you or as delivering kind of facts about you as opposed to being some sort of assessment or inference about you. And because, as I mentioned, the data fall outside of HIPAA, companies can and do in most states and jurisdictions legally sell it to insurers, employers, marketing agencies, law enforcement actors, and more. And of course, the information that is created about you, which might be you have a high propensity towards addiction, or you are anxious. This is information that moves and can go into any of the pipelines that I've listed here. So, for example, it's not outside the realm of possibility to think that you might be the highest ranking applicant for a job, but the hiring manager gets some information from your neural data that was sold to them that says that you have a really hard time focusing after about 2 hours or later in the day, or that maybe you have bipolar or certain markers that suggest an aggressive demeanor, and suddenly that factors in. Advertising companies could use this to identify your psychological vulnerabilities and target you with content designed specifically to influence decisions you think you're making freely. Of course, this is already happening in a way. Anyone who's familiar with Shoshana Zuboff's wonderful work on surveillance capitalism will understand this as an extension and really a leap forward and an entrenchment of that and what she's talking about there. And really one of the areas that I am most concerned about, because also one of the other hats I wear is in the refugee and forced migration landscape, and thinking about how this data could potentially and will likely feed into law enforcement and border enforcement pipelines as well, especially as we've seen various vulnerable communities fall experience an enormous amount of violence at the hands of surveillance systems and government overreach. This is really something to be watching. So I want to note also that a lot of the discussion in this space revolves around privacy, and that's extremely important. But there's another category of risk which is less related to the data and more to the devices and how they are sold. One of the challenges there is, as Dr. Young mentioned before, one bucket of this technology involves devices that can stimulate the brain. And so there's reason to pause and think about kind of at-scale technologies that allow people at home to stimulate their brains without any type of oversight and without any relationship of or duty of care between a medical provider and a patient, where instead you have a relationship of commercialization and onward engagement. And so thinking about what this means is really concerning. And as just one anecdote, I spoke with a clinical psychiatrist about 2 months ago who reached out to me to say that he's been experimenting with consumer devices and neurostimulation. And he is working on a paper, and in one session, he said that he lost his ability to speak for 20 minutes after misplacing the electrodes. And in another session, applying intermittent theta burst TMS, his mood dropped so intensely that he did not want to continue his own experiment and ended up just stopping the study. And this is a licensed clinical psychiatrist who teaches at a top university, has a wonderful record of scholarship and teaching. And he called me to say, if I can't get this right, your everyday early adopter user of neurotechnology who's excited about the next Aura ring probably isn't going to either. And so this doesn't fall under FDA, again, because the devices are not considered medical devices. And so this is really concerning. And the other concern with the lack of FDA engagement is that the devices don't technically need to do what they say they do, right? At-home treatment for depression, sounds great. Wake up feeling less tired, I would love that. And so people lean in with excitement for a better life for themselves, and oftentimes the devices really may not even do anything other than amass enormous data sets of your most sensitive data, which is not to say that none of the devices work. I actually came back from a conference recently with many of the companies, and some of them have genuinely impressive science and are very rigorous about evidencing it, showing online their peer-reviewed studies, making their science legible to consumers. But this is a serious risk as well. And just this is a quote that the individual who I mentioned earlier emailed to me, that he was genuinely, it was surprisingly easy and scary to engender a state that didn't even feel like me. And this was using consumer neurotechnology devices that you can go online right now and put your credit card in and have arrive in a box on Monday. So I mentioned already, and clearly, you know, what this brings to me is obviously a question of identity, right? He's saying I couldn't recognize myself. There's a lack of ability to even understand that the person he is existing as is the person he is. So there are questions with neurotechnology also about if the changes are continuous and cumulative, not a discrete intervention that you went in for and know is happening, but some sort of ongoing modulation of the way that you think, the way that you are. What does that mean about identity? And again, I will note this is already happening, right? We are, and whoever in the back with the glasses, yes, you know, you were saying you study the impact of technology and social media on individuals. My guess, although I'm putting words in your mouth, is that you would argue that we already are being continuously changed and modulated through our engagement with technology. So always with neurotechnology, I try and think what is new, what is different. Elements of this are new, but also elements of it follow and entrench other patterns. And you know, I'll just jump to the last point of the subject might not recognize that any changes have actually been externally produced. It might just feel like, oh, this is who I'm becoming, or oh, it's a stressful world. This is how I am now. And so what does that mean about accountability? What does that mean about the way that we understand people who are socially shifting? And if any of you are particularly interested in this area, I would just mention that there's a wonderful scholar named Dr. Michelle Hampson at Yale School of Medicine who focuses on this question exactly. So again, her name is Michelle Hampson, and Dr. Hampson works specifically looking at what does kind of a population level social nudging look like at scale with emerging neurotechnologies. Really, really scary work, really urgent and important and brilliant work from her as well. Which brings us, of course, to the question of agency, but I'll jump over that because we're talking about it, and the panelists before me spoke so eloquently on it. But really, my argument with that background in place is that the biggest risk here is not actually any of those individual harms happening, but it's that we allow them to happen, and by doing so, we set back the potential of neurotechnologies to actually benefit society and benefit humanity. So the nonprofit I'm here representing, the Neurorights Foundation, our mission is to leverage neurotechnologies for social good and safeguard them from misuse. And that first part is really important. We do genuinely believe that if we do this right, these devices can help people. And like I mentioned before, with the individual who used the Muse headband, he feels that device saved his life. So how can we have more of that, and how can we have it safely? Of course, we've been here before. Many of you will remember or have heard the famous story of Jesse Gelsinger, who at 18 years old died of an adverse reaction while participating in an early gene therapy clinical trial. And this was a highly publicized tragedy, not because the underlying science was wrong, but because the governance and safeguards were not yet in place. And this set back a field with life-saving potential by decades. More recently, of course, we all saw a huge scandal with 23andMe, which was a very different kind of failure, but one that exhibits a similar dynamic in that there's a collapse of public trust and regulatory backlash that is still reshaping the entire consumer genomics industry today. And neurotechnology is not immune to this dynamic, and if anything, it's actually more vulnerable. The data are more intimate than anything we've regulated before. The potential for harms are more personal and existential. And yet we also live in a contradictory moment where people are adopting health technology faster than ever amidst growing skepticism and mistrust of big tech actors. So there's a really interesting landscape here that all of this is occurring in. The Neurorights Foundation, we focus on 5 specific areas, which actually might need to change soon because everything is moving so quickly. But generally, we focus on privacy, identity, agency, fair access, and protection from algorithmic bias. I'm always very careful to say that we are not advocating for new rights. Several other people in this space are. We are not. We are working on the further interpretation of existing rights to integrate these protections. And this is a movement that has been gaining momentum around the world. So a bit of a timeline here. Our first kind of hard law protection in this space was in Chile in 2021, which adopted a constitutional amendment recognizing brain data and activity. Brazil followed with a constitutional amendment, and then also in a specific state, there was one there as well. A number of years ago, Colorado became the first US state to add protections. I'll note these are largely and almost exclusively protections around privacy. So in Colorado, for example, they already had existing privacy infrastructure, the CPA, the Colorado Privacy Act, that said that genetic data, sexual health information, your credit card information, geolocational data are protected with heightened sensitivity. So essentially we went in with a very quick surgical addition and said, well, you know, if you think you should protect your credit card information, wouldn't you want to also protect your neural data? California followed, as did Montana, with very similar efforts. Although we are very careful to say and have said in law as well that neural data and biometric data are different. In Montana, they added a subsection about neural data under their biometric data law. And I just want to note that this is a really interesting mix of states, Colorado, California, and Montana. You probably don't see them all joining hands and dancing together too often. I'm really happy, and I hope I can keep saying this for a while, knock on wood, to say that our efforts have been either unanimous or near unanimous with 1 or 2 dissenting votes only, and entirely bipartisan. In a moment when those words are not even conceivable, right? It sounds like I'm lying to you, right? And we had deep red Montana and Colorado and California at the front of this charge. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of it being that everyone has a brain. Another one, this is not on behalf of the organization. I also think that people have secrets and people lie. Like, frankly, and very candidly, and especially politicians. And so I think politicians on all sides of the aisle don't feel too excited about the idea of their affairs and their embezzlements and their whatever else. And again, I mean, I joke, but it comes down to, like, we are humans, we are cognitive creatures. Every element of who we are and how we exist comes from the brain. And so therefore, the idea that you could access that is really threatening. And then also, while we may speak to more progressive audiences in terms of a language of rights, we often speak to a more conservative audience in talking about national security implications, the BCI industry that China is building. And so there are a lot of different ways to make this resonate with others. So I mentioned earlier on that that there are no protections in Asia. And I just want to quickly dive a little deeper into that, because these protections here we're very proud of. They are the first hard law protections in the world for neurotechnology users, and they also are starting to move the needle. So even though they are modest, in one case in particular, we've already had a Supreme Court ruling in Chile focused on a consumer of neurotechnologies and a company called Emotive. And the Supreme Court sided with the consumer and forced the company to delete the individual's neural data, and citing these laws as a basis. So we are trying to move that forward as well. But even still, and I've also been hearing more and more from companies who are scared of that happening to them, and that they want to get in front of it and have their practices be on the right side of this. So while we are proud of these wins, I'm also aware that they are a baseline, right? There is so much more work to be done, both in extending the baseline and raising it. And so in terms of extending it, there are just, this is not the entire world represented on here of who has protections. And I spent a month across Asia in March, and I held meetings in Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Japan. What I found was really striking, which was that consumer neurotechnology simply was not on the agenda. People were talking about national security implications, people were talking about clinical applications, but questions of what happens with consumer neurotechnologies simply had just not been raised or were considered to be a far off concern. And I've had candid conversations with various CEOs of neurotech companies who have told me candidly that they are pivoting their market almost entirely to Asia, partially given the political landscape of the States, partially given tariff wars and complications, and also many of them feel that there are specific cultural markers in various Asian societies that speak to a likelihood of higher rates of adoption of some of these technologies. And so many of these companies are just quickly turning and pouring their investment and setting up shop across Asia, and yet there's not a single jurisdiction anywhere in Asia that has any of these protections. So again, I just want to make sure that we're building a truly global movement here and recognizing that the harms and the data flows do not respect borders drawn on maps, and that this is something that we'll need to think about very, very carefully. And then in terms of raising the baseline, and Dr. Young mentioned this before as well, privacy is so central, but also we need to do so much more. We need to do redlining about acceptable use cases. We need to have a policy stance on, for example, can children use neurostimulation devices? There's no answer to that question right now. Who decides about what's in acceptable use, what isn't? What do we do about deceptive advertising and marketing? What type of enforcement do we need? And so we have a rare opportunity here to actually influence industry standards before they cement. There's such a sense in every space I go into that we drop the ball with social media and we drop the ball with AI. And when I hear that, I'm like, great, how about we don't drop the ball with neurotechnology and with neuro AI? And so what that requires is proactively building the tools and the consensus from now. And I'm just very quickly, and I am wrapping up, and please do not take pictures of these next few slides, if I can just ask, because this is not super public yet. But my team and I at the Neurorights Foundation are building an annual industry scorecard that will map out the entire neurotechnology space. So any device that is on the market will be scored, and this is a methodology and a tool that we built in collaboration with our colleagues at Consumer Reports. And the idea is that we are essentially trying to make the landscape less opaque, and the guiding question is, what would it look like to incentivize a race to the top, and to have transparency and safety actually be a competitive advantage for companies? And we're at a specific moment of market maturity that we still kind of have a window to try and drive that in. And so, I'll skip over all of the details of it, but essentially you'll be able to go on and see kind of all of the products listed with what they do and don't do, the extent to which their claims are based in science, what the risks are, privacy, encryption, all of that. And then I've blurred out the companies. I actually came from a few weeks ago, an event like this, but everyone in the room was consumer neurotech CEOs, and I ranked and graded all of their companies before coming, and said I was going to show it, but didn't tell them I was blurring it. And Everyone looked like they were on the edge of a panic attack the entire time, and I enjoyed it. It probably wasn't too nice of me, but anyway, don't give too much weight to the scores because they've not been weighted yet. We're still working on our methodology. Like every part. So, for example, if you encrypt neural data, that equals the same as if you say you collect neural data, right? We'll have to decide what means what. But the idea is that you'll be able to have the companies who are doing it right recognized, and then the other companies would have to answer to it. This is just one of the many complementary efforts that must join governance efforts. This would be something that would update every single year. And I was really excited because when I presented this to about 250 neurotechnology funders and CEOs, I thought it was going to be a really, really hostile room. And actually, there was a lot of excitement around this. And they were also feeling that all of their work, all of their investments will collapse. We just need a few bad actors to take out the space. And so they were excited about this, except for a few of the companies who were not, and that's fine, they will rank lower. But really what I want to leave you with is that yes, we have record investments and rapid advancements that are really shaping the landscape of neurotechnology, but also that we need to move towards a world where we don't think that governance constrains innovation if it is carefully done and narrowly tailored. It actually can be what makes this future possible. It can be catalytic, and it can help us make sure that neurotechnology can really benefit people. And good governance, as the name of my talk is, means better neurotechnology, and I really believe that we can build it in rooms like these. So thank you very much, and I look forward to, if there's time for questions, I look forward to that. Thank you.
We do have plenty of time for questions. Okay.
Hello, thank you for the great talk. You began by talking about how neural data, on your view, is categorically different than biometric data, or at least substantially different. It's more sensitive. But then when you're saying with your Neurorights Foundation, you're not advocating for new neurorights, but extensions of existing rights frameworks. I'm just curious how you square those two things. Is that more of a pragmatic decision because it's easier to extend existing frameworks rather than like an ideological position?
No, it's a great question. So one of them is, it's not the idea of don't create new laws or new approaches, but for example, do we need a new right to X? Or does the right to privacy encompass, the violations that we're talking about? We have a right to privacy already, and it needs to be further interpreted and built with appropriate infrastructure around to realize these, as opposed to creating a new right. Also, there is certainly a practical element of it as well, though I'll note before that, we are ideologically opposed to the creation of new rights in this space. We also ground our work in an international human rights approach and various other legal frameworks, and practically speaking as well, even if we got there, there would be no appetite to create a new right. There are prominent voices in the space, as you know, who really focus on this, and their efforts have merit, but interestingly have not been as well received by policymakers or anyone in the international arena.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this was fascinating. So I guess I was just wondering about something fairly specific. It seems like most of the consumer neurotechnology at present is taking information from the brain rather than inputting, intervening on the brain. But you mentioned there were a few of these electrical stimulation devices. So I feel like I have a strong sense of your preferred solution to the issues around data privacy. What do you think would be the right legal approach for regulating things that like stimulate or intervene? Is it that they have to start getting FDA approval the way that I believe radiation emitting devices do, or is it something else?
Yeah, so we've actually been working with various colleagues on starting to formulate the exact full position on this, but one of the main areas that we're starting to move towards is kind of a medical model of a consumer device, essentially, and the idea that there are severe enough risks, not just to humanity, although there are, but to one's bodily integrity and safety, that therefore would require some sort of engagement by the FDA or others. We've had really interesting conversations with the FDA, the FTC, for whom this is on their radar, but want evidence of harm that is happening. And I know that that is a camp of, that is a way of thinking. It's not the way that I think, but what I've heard from a lot of those conversations is essentially, this is all very interesting, and come back to us when you can point to cases of that person suffered this effect and this person was deceived in that way. So it might also mean that for kind of more advocacy and research groups like mine, building up programming that can track and identify those cases, which will increasingly come, particularly in the deceptive advertising space. This is one that where really, and I mentioned before the Center for Future Generations in Brussels, which does wonderful work. They've done a report recently on deceptive advertising and starting to just look into even, are the claims, A, rooted in science, and B, is the science peer reviewed? And you wouldn't be thrilled by the answers. So that's something we want to move towards as well.
So this is apparently what happens when you get a bunch of philosophers in a room. I had the exact same question about the biometric data and neural data, but I'm gonna ask like a different one. So you started off by saying that one of the reasons we need neurorights and neurotech governance is because the technology is going to become ubiquitous. And I wonder if you could reflect on that, just because it seems like ethicists working in that space have been saying that for a while, and I wonder if it really is going to become ubiquitous, if there are challenges to that. And then my other question is, I might ask you to reflect a little on the distinction between this space and AI, because the idea that good governance leads to better neurotech, it sounds like you think is something that CEOs of neurotech companies are embracing. It's definitely not something that, maybe not, but maybe I can ask you to reflect on that. But in AI, I mean, it's moved a lot faster, right? Which is partly why I'm asking about the pacing and whether or not you really think it's going to become ubiquitous. But also it seems like applied ethicists as a community have kind of failed at doing anything about AI to this point. So is there a difference? Is there a similarity between the two fields? Interested in your thoughts.
These are wonderful questions. On the first one, I usually try not to make predictions, especially in front of people, because they usually blow up. But I do not expect in the near future widespread implantable neurotechnologies for non-medical applications. I have had wonderful conversations with people who disagree with me, but that is personally, I think a world of kind of fitness, health, wellness, wearables that collect neural data being really widespread is much more likely. I've also been, my colleagues and I have been closely tracking neurotechnologies that are being developed for education and classroom settings, and there are already a number of companies and programs with schools that are exploring what this means. And essentially my answer to you on this narrow point is, if we get to a point, and it is an if, that the technology has a meaningful ability to increase or augment your cognitive capabilities, then I think yes. I think people lean towards efficiency, whether it's perceived or real efficiency. I think people lean towards any sort of offloading. And given how kind of obsessed people seem to be with optimization, I therefore see a world in which we're saying this small little thing can make you. I mean, in my intro, Michael mentioned that I'm publishing a book this year, and if I could, I think I wrote that book in like 3 manic bursts. over years, if I could have sat down and accessed flow state and not just like stared at a blank screen for months, I would have really enjoyed that. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, if the technologies really do what they, get to a point where they do what they say they do, yes. Before that, it will be the early adopters and the kind of health enthusiasts who are always going to take the newest, sexiest product. Otherwise, some people will be like, I don't need that. But I do know that I think we would be mistaken to discount the impact on athletics as well. There are a number, I won't say which ones, but there are a number of sports teams and athletics departments who have told me that they've even started integrating neural monitoring. And concerningly to me, the athletes cannot play in the season. Like I essentially asked, can the athletes say no? And they said yes, but they won't play. And so I think we should look towards the athletic space as one where this might really grow. In terms of parallels to AI, I'll also concede the point that to date, our efforts have not meaningfully harmed the business models of companies. Some would disagree and say it harmed them, but I think they'll be okay if they have to add heightened levels of sensitivity. If and when we get to more, if we make more decisions about what is required, and the capital of the company suffers because of it, it probably will be less of a kumbaya moment. So part of what we're also trying to do, frankly, is move it as forward as we can before there's some sort of big backlash in that way. I also don't know how much stock to put into this, and scholars of the internet and sociology would know much more than I would, but anecdotally, I am experiencing, particularly from parents, a total disdain for technology, in a sense that screens and social media have destroyed their children's ability to emote, to communicate, their mental health. And the people who are most loudly and strongly, forcefully coming to me saying we need this are parents. And so I don't know if that's just more of the same or if there's kind of a breaking point that will be reached, but I'd be very curious to, I hope that it's not just more of the same, but we don't have a great track record to look back on. I'll agree with you on that one.
I think there's going to be major challenges for the neurotechnology to transition into the mainstream, partly because we currently have challenges with established pre-existing technologies like vaccines, like the anti-vax movement is not very small. So I think with neurotechnology, it's going to be even bigger because there's so much skepticism around like any establishment at all. So I think that's going to be a major challenge.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the distrust of medical professionals and science is very high. I'll note though that these companies are very careful to say that they are not medical and maybe that they're not even science. So I don't know if the parallel tracks fully. I would point more towards, as I mentioned, the total embrace of health tracking technologies like Whoop, Fitbit, Aura, and the sexy upgrade that now it tracks your neural activity as well, and that being more of an upgrade that happens overnight rather than a big, loud transformation of we live in a new world now, but rather, okay, the next model does this, just like Apple's AirPods, right? I mean, I don't go anywhere with my AirPods because I live in New York and the noise canceling. And there are, hundreds of millions of users of Apple AirPods. That's not to say that every person who has an AirPod today will use the EEG AirPods, but I don't personally see an enormous amount of resistance to using Apple AirPods, especially when they say, but we can give you targeted music playlists based on your emotional state. I think a lot of people are going to be really excited about that, actually.
I was just wondering to the question earlier on about like where you said you had to demonstrate harm, that the devices are harmful, and like if you could just say a little bit more about what's accepted as categories of harm and what maybe you would like to see as accepted, because I'm like, you know, somebody working on agency and freedom, and like even John Stuart Mill, when he invokes his harm principle, is not so good at thinking about actually the harm to freedom, even though the essay is about freedom. So there's like I could imagine the FDA it's easier if it's some kind of medical category, right, of harm, then yeah.
Right, especially because with this, as with some other categories of harm, a lot of it might not be discernible to any outside observer or fully legible to the individual. Or if it is, it might be years or decades away also. One of the areas that I think will need to be actively brought into discussion involves neurodiversity, disability, and neurotechnologies. I've been working closely with a number of neurodiversity and disability advocates who are one of the groups that's actually most excited about what the technology could do, but then also really concerned along many angles, one of them being the idea of kind of homogenizing the human brain and saying, actually, there's one way that a brain should be, or, oh great, now we have a tool that can fix your ADHD, and that this could kind of, whether directly or indirectly and socially, lead to kind of an erasure of neurodiverse sensibilities, cognition, whatever it may be. So, the reality is that work has not been done to answer your question of a full mapping of what is the full range of harms that can happen in the consumer space. I think probably as a starting point, and my guess is that some of Dr. Young's colleagues are working on this already, but I think we could learn a lot from the medical community and the harms that have been identified there, but some of them will be different. And so that is a mapping that needs to be done. And again, I mean, on kind of definitions as well, few people will disagree on what constitutes a harm. And that's where a lot of the redlining also has to happen in the neurotechnology space, where there's some sort of sense of what is and is not an acceptable use. I'm not saying this is the type of harm you're talking about necessarily, but for example, I was at a conference recently where there was intense disagreement in the room about whether companies should be allowed to mandate that their employees undergo neural monitoring. And that had a lot of disagreement just as said, and then they added in the wrinkle of, okay, does it change your mind if I say that one of the employees is a sales rep and the other employee is a neurosurgeon, or is on top of the control tower at an airport? And that further fractured people. So they were like, okay, so actually this is not absolute. So you're saying that in some times you think it might be okay, at other times it isn't. And so there's enormous disagreement and fracturing along these lines. And again, it's why I really like being in an interdisciplinary room like this, because it's where we need the ethicists, the philosophers, people with lived experience. It's bringing them all together, the lawyers, that neuroengineers, to reach clarity on what that looks like.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Two questions. One about AI, one about the observation that so much of this market originates in the private sector. About AI, we're kind of distinguishing between AI and having dropped the ball on AI and hopefully not dropping the ball on neurotech. It seems like progress in AI is pretty crucial for progress in neurotech, and that AI, for example, could bridge the gap between, at some point, not now, but between implantable and non-implantable BCIs. So, for example, right now we're more concerned about implantable BCIs because the data is, well, both because they're intrusive and there's more medical risks, but the data is richer and more precise, etc. You could imagine non-science fiction progress in AI which would allow for a higher level of interpretation from non-implantable BCI to bridge the gap. So that's one question about the role you see for AI kind of as the technology evolves. The other one, the other question is a direct analogy to some of what's going on in the policy space about AI. So Bernie Sanders recently proposed a sort of public utility approach towards AI. Given that potentially the stakes here could be higher, not yet, not with the sports application, but along the lines that we've just been talking about, seems to be some specific problems in leaving this in the private sector. On the more humdrum end of the scale, what happens if you get a BCI for Parkinson's and it stops your tremor and the company goes out of business and you're left with it in your head? And on the more scary Black Mirror end of the scale, if you do end up with a technology that reads your inner monologue, should the private sector be in charge of that?
Yeah, no. And certainly this is not a moment that inspires a great amount of trust in the idea of industry self-regulation. I also would say we're at a moment where there's maybe a bit more breakdown between traditional notions of industry and government. And industry leaders and tech actors are governance actors. And also that's my opinion, not the opinion of the foundation. But I think that the individuals that we normally place trust into for wellness and safety and rights, and who has authority to change that, it's a changing landscape. On the point of AI, certainly, I mean, this is the neuro AI frontier. I get frustrated sometimes when we're trying to fundraise and I talk to foundations and they say, we work on AI. And I'm like, yes, so do we. I mean, all of these devices use AI. This is where AI is going. And something that was really interesting to me from speaking with investors and some CEOs in this space, some of them are in this because they're really excited about the technology. Some of them see that it's a cash cow. Some of the other ones told me, we want to model the brain. And actually, it's AI companies trying to get into neurotech to improve AI algorithms and to improve the power of AI. And there's even some really interesting conversations going on with some colleagues I know who have, for their entire careers, been staunchly consistent about what the definition of a neurotechnology is. Starting to say, well, can an algorithm be a neurotechnology? Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? What does that mean about the boundaries of the space? And so I think also it's AI this, AI that. Right now, when everyone is talking about AI, to the extent that no one is talking about this, it's going to be interesting to see if this becomes part of that moment or not. And I think that will impact the governance of it all. I also will say, I just mentioned him very, very briefly, but Elon Musk is a central player in the neurotechnology investment space, at least, and development. And he's also a political figure in this country, though unelected. But I do think we will continue to see it's a matter of time until this issue is politicized, and it hasn't really happened yet in a way that I've the MIND Act, which was mentioned earlier, was brought forward by 3 Democratic senators, but there are Republican colleagues in the House who are looking to advance a similar effort. But I would not be surprised if any day now some prominent official came out in a certain way or said something that then immediately made this an us or them type of moment. So that's happened with AI, that's happening with AI, and it may well happen here as well.
Okay, we're out of time for questions. I hope I got to everyone. Let's thank our keynote speaker.